What's next for a neighborhood under siege? We'll have to wait and see. Reporting live, Sadie Sinclair, Channel 7 News.
This is San Francisco.
Welcome back to San Francisco. GrowSF and TogetherSF are a couple of the more nefarious local political organizations with visions for a Bay Area where there is an empty luxury condo and private cop on every corner, with Muni and BART replaced by driverless Ubers. And GrowSF and TogetherSF are supported by a who's who of local miscreants with names like Chris Larson, crypto bro from Ripple, Manhattan Institute troll Diane Yap, Elon Musk, and the self-described neoliberal Yimby, Stephen Buss. The lack of transparency around elections and who is funding local politicians is, of course, a major reason that so many of us are disillusioned with democracy and find it very hard to believe that voting can make a difference. We can't vote our way to a liberated world. And yet, I'm always curious to see where the millionaires and billionaires who want to control the rest of us are putting their money. Julie Pitta is a journalist who lives in the Richmond, previously from the LA Times, who writes a column at the Richmond Review. She co-founded the Phoenix Project, which was set up to track dark money at organizations like GrowSF and TogetherSF and others, attempting to kind of rein in the liberatory spirit of San Francisco. And if you like the show, please go to patreon.com/San Francisco and send us a few bucks to help with the editing and podcast hosting for the show, which I and Tofu work to get to you every week. Thanks, Mira, for suggesting the topic. Julie is on next. I wanted to actually ask if you could kind of lay out what the Phoenix Project is all about.
The Phoenix Project is a voter education project. It's really got a very single, very tight focus, which is to expose the sources and the agenda of all this dark money that's pouring into San Francisco elections. So we'll be educating people through articles, both on the website and in third-party media. We'll eventually go to different community groups and laying out this network of money, where it comes from, what it wants. These things are not easy for the average voter to find out about. So we have researchers who are looking at IRS filings, at election filings, to find out the sources of these money and to follow it as it travels throughout the electoral process.
Yeah, any resources that can help us in the face of these really, really well-funded groups that represent a very small minority of, for the most part, tech bros. I really appreciate any kind of educational groups that are helping us see through that kind of noise from the right wing. So how did you first become aware of GrowSF?
First time I became aware of them was during the recalls. They were rather active in the recall of the school board and our former district attorney, Chase Boudin. And they're very active on social media, which, as a journalist, I feel as though I have to engage in social media. So if you're on Twitter, if you're on Facebook, if you're on Instagram, it's really hard to miss GrowSF.
I've seen their stuff across all of the various social media platforms, and they have a lot of money to sink into these ad campaigns that tend to be about these recalls that you mentioned of the school board and Chesa Boudin. I think it's fair to say that they are conservative causes. And in your Richmond Review column about GrowSF recently, you described a cabal of big tech and real estate interests behind the group. What are some of the names of people who are driving GrowSF in this cabal?
Well, Garry Tan, I think it was about a year or so ago, joined the board of GrowSF, and he brings considerable resources. He's a billionaire who made a good deal of money in crypto. After that drunken tweet that he sent out in which he threatened 7 members of the board of supervisors, people are urging GrowSF to distance themselves from Mr. Tan. I'm not sure that they will. So far, they've been notably silent.
Yeah, we have a previous episode of the show with Emily Mills, who has been tracking a lot of what Garry's up to since he started to indicate that he has a love for trying to influence local politics. And like you said, he has a lot of money to do that. So the situation with his most recent sort of public kind of embarrassing tweets that he later apologized for, could you talk a little bit about what happened with that?
Well, what happened was over the weekend, this past weekend, late at night, it seems that Garry Tan, at least by his own admission, was drinking too much and used the lyrics from a Tupac rap to wish harm to members, not only 7 members of the Board of Supervisors, but also their supporters. He later apologized twice. The first apology was really not sufficient for what he had done. And here's where my concern was, and that of many people in San Francisco, I believe, good people, is that I didn't think Garry Tan was going to go out and physically cause harm to these 7 members of the Board of Supervisors, but he blasted this out on social media. He has a lot of followers. People can participate on social media through pseudonyms. No one has any idea who they are, and no one has any idea what they're about. So in the subsequent days, these members of the board received these strange looking postcards with Garry's face on it and doubling down on the threat. My supervisor out here in the Richmond district, Connie Chan, just received one. I believe it was yesterday. That's deeply concerning. I have been shocked that the mayor has stayed silent on all of this. I've been shocked that GrowSF, which has a formal association with Mr. Tan, has stayed silent on all of this. I'm shocked that Marjan Philhauer, who was endorsed by GrowSF, has stayed silent on all of this.
Yeah, it's unfortunate to know that apparently locally, it seems like there's cult of Garry Tan. I don't know how many members it has, but I also am irritated by the fact that Garry has really in the past come out as this person who supports the Stop Asian Hate movement and has been fawned over for his work allegedly to Stop Asian Hate. I'm not really qualified to talk about like what the extent of that work is, but he does associate himself a lot with these movements to diversify tech, diversify Hollywood. He has support and supports the Asian American Foundation, which has also not said anything about Garry's words. And also his wife started what she calls the first Asian American publishing house recently, Third State Books. And it's just interesting that a lot of these right-wing people, there's hypocrisy abounds, but it's still irritating. And like you said, if he has these people that are kind of hanging on his every word, because he's sort of a mentor, Y Combinator, the startup incubator, probably the most famous of startup incubators in Silicon Valley, that claims to have seeded companies that collectively have made $800 billion since its inception. I mean, it seems like this is a guy who obviously does have power, and all it takes is a few of his followers to get together and decide to do something that translates into physical violence. And people can go back if they want to hear more about Garry to our previous episode, which I'll link in the show notes. You also speak to a couple of the conservative causes that they're attempting to push through in your column in the local elections that are coming up. Could you talk about some of those?
Yeah, Proposition E and Proposition F are the 2 initiatives that they seem to care deeply about. Proposition E is an attempt to lessen oversight of the San Francisco Police Department. Anyone who's lived in San Francisco for any length of time knows that the department has not only been poorly managed, it's been rife with problems regarding its relationship with communities of color. It's been problematic in terms of its use of force. It wasn't that long ago that our police chief, Greg Sir, was fired after, I guess it was less than a dozen incidents in which unarmed civilians were harmed by SFPD officers. The other proposition there behind is Proposition F, which is trying to link government assistance checks to treatment for drug and alcohol addiction, particularly drug addiction. I honestly think that should that measure pass, that it'll wind up in court. It just doesn't seem that it would be legal to do so. But they like these very tough sounding measures that take us back to policy solutions that really have failed. This is sounding very much like war on drugs rhetoric. The problem regarding Proposition E, the problem with the SFPD is not that they have oversight, that their hands are tied. It's that we have a department that is bloated with civilian staff. Public safety resources are not well deployed in San Francisco.
Yeah, I think it was just last week that the news broke that this organization called SF Safe, which the SFPD had a contract with, just spent millions of dollars on limo rides, trips to Tahoe, and gift boxes. I mean, that's just kind of like some of the latest news on how the only department, that London Breed doesn't want to cut funding from in the next budget year, the SFPD. That's just kind of like the latest news on how they're managing their cash. And you also mentioned TogetherSF, which is a GrowSF aligned group. Could you speak to the resources that TogetherSF, Michael Moritz, has put into the conservative causes in SF?
Michael Moritz is another tech billionaire. He's a venture capitalist. He has spent in the last 3 years $300 million to influence city elections. He does it through TogetherSF Action, which is a political action committee. There's a loophole in our campaign financing laws that allows unlimited contributions via these political action committees. So the $500 cap that individuals are limited to in terms of their campaign contributions, these groups can receive and spend unlimited amounts of money.
Yeah, I first became aware of Michael Moritz because he was one of the funders behind SF Standard.
Yes.
Which has, in the space of like 3 years, I think they have really good search engine optimization, become one of the major news sources, in addition to some partnerships with other news organizations in the Bay that people will probably see the most when they're looking for local news. That's not to say that there's the occasional piece that ends up in SF Standard that I think is like pretty well investigated. But we were talking about Garry Tan a little while ago, and they've run a number of these really adoring puff pieces about Garry and his ideas for how to remake San Francisco. I mean, take what you read at the SF Standard with that big grain of salt that they are aligned with some of these tech billionaires, like you said, Garry Tan, Michael Moritz. A lot of these people behind groups like GrowSF, they like to use the term moderate Democrat to describe themselves. And I think anyone who isn't like paying a lot of attention to local politics and politicians could get the wrong idea from that. Certainly people outside of the Bay presume, San Francisco is like this big blue zone, everyone votes Democrat. But what does moderate Democrat even really mean?
I would agree. I think they've stretched that definition so that it doesn't mean much of anything. I think these so-called moderate Democrats, and the worst thing you can tell them is that they are proposing Republican policy measures. I think they agree on women's right to choose. I think they agree on gay rights. And I think they would say that they are anti-racist. And yet the measures that they are proposing will hurt communities of color. They're actually vicious towards homeless people. They believe in policing. They believe in a return to the failed Reagan-era war on drugs. If you remove their liberal bona fides on a couple of social issues, they sound very much like the Republican right elsewhere in the country.
Totally agree. I was in Chicago and Boston recently, and friends in both places had picked up on the recent speech that London Breed did, where she was talking about her vision of going back to the war on drugs and talking about how San Francisco is a place with too much compassion. And that's our problem. And that's why we have so many ODs. And I think if people had goodwill towards our mayor from the outside looking in, she lost a lot of people there. It is very much, like you said, something that people expect from Republicans. And it's hard for people outside looking in to hear that coming from a Democrat and to know what to do with that. One thing I actually did want to ask about is a major part of their strategy is to collect names in order to create a voter database. Do you know about that at all? Have you gotten some of their mailers?
I have. They've been very, very clever. They have these social events and these lecture series, and they've targeted different groups. They targeted parents. I think it's the first time I've seen parents being used as a voting bloc with the school board recalls. They targeted Chinese Americans, particularly during the recall of Chesa Boudin. And now they're targeting, and I'm not surprised by this given their own backgrounds in tech, they're targeting newcomers, the 25% of largely tech professionals who come to the Bay Area to live, don't know very much about politics, might be lonely, so go to a TogetherSF garbage pickup. And then they get their emails harvested. The one thing that we haven't covered is that this is a network, that these groups are all working together. And that's what we at the Phoenix Project are uncovering. You'll see in the upcoming election that new political action committees will be formed. They'll have very benign names like Neighbors for a Vibrant San Francisco, or, I'm making one up. They will be getting money from TogetherSF. They will be getting money from GrowSF. They will be getting money from Abundance-SF, which is another one of these groups. And they will send out flyers targeting different demographic groups that they think are persuadable. The other issue that you brought up, which I find interesting, is Garry Tan has tried to stand up for the interests of Asian Americans, and yet he targeted the only two Chinese American members of the Board of Supervisors. He successfully targeted Gordon Marr, and now he's going after Connie Chan. And he's doing it not only in Connie's case, he's doing it not only with his money, GrowSF has a Clear Out Connie fund, but he's also doing it by targeting her via hate speech. So how can a man who has stood up against anti-Asian hate direct that towards a Chinese American woman?
Forrest Liu, who I became aware of him because he was behind at City Hall. There was a protest that was kind of an anti-homeless protest, but in a very gross way. It was targeting this injunction that a judge hit the city with because the city continues to conduct sweeps without any just very basic bare necessity type beds for people to go. And so I think a lot of us have seen it, like people are just getting moved from block to block, kind of crazy making. And so Forrest Liu, who Connie Chan has reported for harassment a couple times, was behind that particular, very, very just insidious protest against this injunction against street sweeps. It's complicated, it's gross, but it's real. How can people follow your work and follow the Phoenix Project?
Well, we have a website, phoenixprojectnow.com. And I also write a monthly column, which is accessible online, and it's sfrichmondreview.com.
Thank you so much, Julie. We'll put links to all the resources you mentioned in the show notes and hopefully have you back again soon.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to Sad Francisco, which is produced by Toshio Moronic and edited by Tofu Estolas. If you have it, please throw us a few dollars through patreon.com/sadfrancisco, which will help us pay for podcast hosting, editing, and transcriptions for the show. See you next time in Sad Francisco.